Good morning, everyone, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and also Nobel Peace Prize laureate. This July was the warmest month on Earth since at least 1850. And up in Svalbard, we have observed record temperatures every month since December 2010. Severe weather events that used to happen once every century now happens maybe 2 or 3 times a decade. Sometimes even more often. Extreme weather events affect many parts of the world. In the Sahel, there are increasing number of conflicts because of lack of water and land for farming. As the Lake Chad shrinks, the livelihoods of entire population groups are disappearing, and it's the perfect breeding ground for extremism and terrorism. In Iraq, water scarcity undermining prospects for lasting peace. In Afghanistan, in Yemen, water tables have fallen dramatically. And rising sea levels and hurricanes, some of them we can see in the news today as we speak, they hit a number of island states. I recently visited Tuvalu, which is a small island in the South Pacific. And I also saw the existential threats that they are facing. And to put it very simply and easily, when the ice melts in the Arctic, the sea level rises in the South Pacific. Small island developing states are maybe one of the most vulnerable states we have. They are not responsible for the climate change, but they are highly affected by it. All of this are clear signs that the global climate change is accelerating even faster than scientists had feared. And to put it in the words of Secretary General Guterres, climate change is now moving faster than we are. We must meet this realization with the urgency to act. A few weeks ago, I gave my annual opening address to the Global Outlook event at Arendalsuka. And my first point was to describe the so-called normal is over. And I described it with climate change. I said, firstly, I want to make a point of starting with one area that is paradoxically too often left out in the discussion of geopolitics, namely climate change. I say paradoxically because geopolitics is about analyzing the influence of geography on international politics. Typically, we see geography as relatively fixed, allowing us to make predictions about political choices. But it may well be that when we look back at this era, the biggest change to our normality will not be political shifts, but the changes to geography itself due to climate change. A changing geography globally in terms of temperatures, extreme weather events, availability of water, sustainability of food production, rising sea level, scarcity of resources in many regions, brings with it a potential for conflict, humanitarian crisis, and migration. And that is also why, in June, Norway put climate change, peace, and security on the agenda of the Oslo Forum, which is the world's leading retreat for peace mediators. Let me acknowledge then the timeliness of Oslo Pax, and I commend the Nobel Peace Center for convening this on peace and climate. The risks associated with climate-related disasters are already a reality for millions of people around the world, and the risks are not going away. In the latest edition of the Global Risk Report, the World Economic Forum ranks environmental threats on top of the list for the 3rd year in a row, both in terms of impact and of likelihood. Extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change are listed as the risk most likely to happen over the next 10 years. I often refer to climate change as a threat multiplier, in particular in conditions of weak governance and institutions, fragility and insecurity, it can increase tensions and conflict. Climate change threatens human security by impacting economic growth, food prices, undermining livelihoods, and prompting displacement and forced migration. The World Bank estimates that without urgent climate action, more than 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America will migrate within their own country's borders by 2050, putting a lot of pressure and strain on the coping capacities of already vulnerable communities and cities. While the impact of climate change is spread unevenly across different regions, it remains clear that this is a global challenge which will affect us all in the long term. Major armies, major defense ministries like Pentagon, major businesses, they have realized this long ago. They have planned for how climate change is a threat multiplier and can cause conflict. They have assessed that political leadership and diplomacy is lagging behind, and we cannot let it lag behind. We must act now with a sense of urgency and commitment to place people, and especially those most vulnerable and marginalized, at the center of our efforts. And even if we curb emissions to the 1.5-degree goal, and even if we improve our climate security response, for many people around the world, that response will be too little too late. A strong focus on adaptation and disaster risk management is necessary to ensure that we can sustain and advance the national development priorities and achieve the 2030 agenda. We must invest in resilience. In economic terms alone, that makes sense. According to the World Bank again, investing in more resilient infrastructure will give $4 in benefit for every dollar invested. But investing in resilience also presents a huge opportunity to support employment and development, which ultimately enhances security. Norway will increase our support to climate adaptation, to resilience, and to food security. This will complement what we are already doing within humanitarian assistance. And I would like to underline here that one of the reasons why Norway's humanitarian budget has increased with almost 65% over the past 6 years is climate change. We are facing more complex and more long-lasting crises, and many of them stem from or are enhanced by climate change. The average humanitarian crisis nowadays lasts for 8 years, and they come again and again and again in the same areas. Climate change is increasingly and frequently an important part of the context, not only for humanitarian crisis, but also in our focus on fragile and vulnerable states, for our peace and reconciliation efforts, and for our security policy. Ladies and gentlemen, the UN Security Council has the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. The climate security nexus is, in our opinion, to be firmly placed on the Council's agenda. Germany has started this work, and as you know, we are a candidate for the Security Council as well, hoping to pick up the torch after Germany, and we are already cooperating very closely on this bilaterally. In my view, the Security Council should both acknowledge that climate change is a concrete and existential threat to humanity, and that developing countries are particularly at risk and vulnerable. So mitigating climate-related disaster impacts, it benefits global stability and conflict prevention. We also have to engage the whole UN system on climate change. The UN Security Council has one special role, which is to mandate on the security impacts of climate change, and it's complementary to the mandate of other UN bodies. We have to increase the analytical capacity of the UN to better understand the climate fragility risks and formulate evidence-based responses. We have to support improvement of early warning systems. Sometimes we say that Norway and Pacific states are like the canaries in the coal mine because we see climate change very soon. I mean, in the Arctic, climate change is happening twice as fast as anywhere else on Earth. So we can predict what is going to happen, but can we do something about the prediction? That's the big question. And we also need to convene regular briefings on climate risks and progress made. Climate change, ladies and gentlemen, is not something that respects national borders or national sovereignty. It is one of the topics that no single country can solve alone. It is maybe, as I see it, the most prominent issue when we talk about the need for strengthening multilateralism and international cooperation. This is an issue we cannot do alone. It is just simply not an option. This also serves as a very good backdrop for why we presented a white paper to Parliament in June on multilateralism, Norway's role, and how to strengthen it. I presented it together, again, with my German colleague, Heiko Maas. And I do think that by rising to this challenge, we can demonstrate the purpose of the multilateral system, the purpose of international cooperation that makes us take risks and commit ourselves beyond our own narrow self.